Too often, public policy is judged by its intentions rather than its consequences. Few modern examples illustrate this confusion more clearly than sanctuary city policies. Proponents speak in the language of compassion, tolerance, and safety. But policies should be evaluated not by the nobility of their rhetoric, but by the realities they create. When examined in that light, sanctuary city policies reveal a trail of preventable harm, borne disproportionately by law-abiding citizens, vulnerable communities, and even the very immigrants these policies claim to protect. Sanctuary policies generally restrict cooperation between local law enforcement and federal immigration authorities, particularly when it comes to honoring detainers for individuals already in custody. The stated rationale is that limiting cooperation encourages trust between immigrant communities and local police. Yet this theory rests on a critical assumption, that criminals and law-abiding residents will respond in the same way to such policies. Decades of evidence suggest otherwise. The most infamous illustration of the costs of sanctuary policies is the death of Kate Steinle in San Francisco in 2015. Steinle was killed by a man who had entered the country illegally, been deported multiple times, and was in local custody shortly before the shooting. Federal authorities had requested notification prior to his release. San Francisco, operating under its sanctuary policies, declined to cooperate. The result was not an abstract policy failure, but a young woman dead on a public pier, a life extinguished not by accident, but by a series of deliberate policy choices. This was not an isolated tragedy. Similar cases have occurred in jurisdictions across the country, where repeat offenders, often with long criminal records, were released back into communities despite clear opportunities to transfer custody to federal authorities. These cases rarely make national headlines, but their cumulative toll is measured in assaults, robberies, and homicides that would not have occurred had existing laws been enforced. Sanctuary policies also distort incentives within the criminal justice system. When local jurisdictions refuse to cooperate with federal immigration enforcement, they effectively create a class of offenders who face fewer consequences than others committing the same crimes. A citizen and a non-citizen may commit identical offenses, yet only one is subject to an additional layer of accountability. This disparity undermines the principle of equal treatment under the law, an idea that is foundational to a functioning legal system. Ironically, the most perverse consequence of sanctuary policies is how they harm law-abiding illegal immigrants. When local authorities refuse to turn over known criminals already in custody, federal agencies are left with fewer targeted options. Instead of taking custody of offenders in jails, where due process has already occurred, immigration authorities must locate individuals in the community. This leads to broader enforcement actions that inevitably sweep up people who were otherwise living quietly, working, and raising families. In other words, sanctuary policies trade precision for chaos. A criminal alien who could have been transferred safely from a jail is instead released, while enforcement efforts shift outward into neighborhoods and workplaces. The predictable result is fear among law-abiding immigrants, increased disruption to families, and a greater sense of insecurity, precisely the outcomes sanctuary advocates claim to oppose. Moreover, sanctuary policies place local law enforcement in an untenable position. Officers are asked to ignore relevant information, refrain from cooperating with other agencies, and release individuals they know pose a danger. This is not community policing, it is institutionalized blindfolding. It also erodes morale among officers whose duty is to protect the public, not to adjudicate federalism debates on the street. Perhaps the most troubling aspect of sanctuary policies is how they transform tragic outcomes into political abstractions. When harm occurs, responsibility is diffused. Officials point to federal failures, systemic inequities, or broader social forces. But policies are choices, and choices have consequences. A system that repeatedly releases known offenders while claiming moral superiority over enforcement is not compassionate. It is reckless. Minnesota is the latest flashpoint in the battle over sanctuary policies. precisely because the incentives and trade-offs underlying those policies have now collided with federal enforcement. In the Twin Cities and across the state, a massive federal effort to locate and detain criminal illegal aliens has provoked sharp backlash as state and local officials resist cooperation. Federal authorities have highlighted that many of the individuals now being arrested are not minor offenders, but include those convicted of violent crimes, including child rape and murder, who were allegedly roaming freely prior to their detention by U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement agents. A society governed by laws cannot function if those laws are selectively enforced or deliberately undermined. Compassion without accountability is not mercy. It is negligence. Sanctuary city policies exemplify a recurring pattern in public policy: the elevation of intentions over outcomes, slogans over statistics, and ideology over evidence. The lesson is neither complicated nor new. When policymakers refuse to confront the real-world effects of their decisions, it is ordinary people who pay the price, often with their safety, sometimes with their lives.
Can you say why America is the greatest country in the world?
Freedom and freedom. So let's keep it that way.
I think that the real job that we have that confronts us is to somehow be able to sell our fellow Americans on the moral superiority of personal liberty.
I would remind you that extremism in the defense of liberty is no vice.